All right, so good evening. We are still on Chapter 1. This is Section 6 now. We finished Section 5. We are now moving to Section 6. Section 6 will actually have 3 parts. This is Part 1, and the title of the section is Solving Quadratic Equations by Factoring. Okay. Also, still review. You do know how to factor. You may not remember how you know how to factor, but you do know how to factor. So the objective of this particular section is to introduce quadratic equations and to solve them by factoring. Okay, so Section 6, Part 1. Okay, so let's first start off by defining what a quadratic equation is. And a quadratic equation is any equation that's highest exponent is an x squared term. Okay, so any equation that has the highest exponent as an x squared term. For example, 3x squared minus 6x plus 2 is a quadratic equation. Now remember, quadratic equations always have to have equal signs, so there is a little bit better of an example. You could also have 6x squared plus 1 equals 0, so anything where the highest exponent is 2 is considered a quadratic equation. An example of something that is not a quadratic equation would be 6x to the third minus 4x squared plus 2 equals 0. So if we notice, it has an x squared, but it's not the highest exponent. 3 is the highest. So this would not be a quadratic equation. Okay? So the general form of a quadratic equation is ax squared. Oops, made a mistake there. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so the general form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, so that's the general form, where a, b, and c can be any number. Okay, but that's very important that we know what the general form of a quadratic equation is. All right, so we have 2 words that are very important. We have this word root, and we have the word solution, and they mean the exact same thing. Those are the same thing. It says a root or a solution of a quadratic equation is a value of the variable that satisfies the equation. You're probably thinking, what in the heck does that mean? So, for example, the question is the point x equals negative 3 a solution or a root, remember, those are the same thing, of the quadratic equation x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So, what you need to do is you need to take your point, x equals negative 3, and plug it in. So I have negative 3 squared plus 5 times negative 3 plus 6 equals 0. So if it is a solution, it will work out correctly. Negative 3 squared, negative 3 times negative 3 is 9, plus 5 times negative 3 is negative 15, plus 6 equals 0. 9 plus 6 is 15, plus a negative 15 should equal 0. So 0 equals 0. Is that true? Yes, it is. So, negative 3 is a root or solution. So, if the left and the right are equal to each other like this one, 0 is equal to 0, then it is a root or a solution. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that is review for you. So, there are 3 methods to solve quadratic equations. First method, factoring. Second method, completing the square. Third method, quadratic formula. All do the exact same thing, but we do need to know how to do all 3. We are only going to focus on factoring for this particular section. So this one will be in part 2, completing the square, and part 3 will be quadratic formula. So moving on. So we have what's called a factored form, and we have general form. General form we just talked about. We have ax squared plus bx plus c, factored form. So you need to be able to go back and forth from each of these forms. So let me show you how they are exactly the same. So let's take this left and let's FOIL. X times x is x squared. X times negative 3 is negative 3x. 2 times x is 2x. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. So let's add our like terms. X squared. Negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1x, and then we have a minus 6. Notice that is the same thing as our general form. So, how we factored in Algebra 2, let's factor. Okay, so you need 2 sets of parentheses. And let's remember, so What times what is x squared? So we know x times x is x squared. What times what? So the two numbers have to multiply to be negative 6, but add to negative 1. So what two numbers multiply to be negative 6, but add to a negative 1? So hopefully you can see that that is a negative 3 and 2. Negative 3 times 2 equals negative 6, but negative 3 plus 1 equals plus 2 equals a negative 1. So they have to multiply to be negative 6 and add to be the middle number. Okay? And as you can tell, that is now the same thing as we have here. Okay? So you need to be able to go back and forth from factor form to general and from general to factor. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to run through a bunch of examples to show you how to solve equations by factoring. Okay, so if you notice, this one is already factored for us. It always needs to equal 0 on the right to be able to solve the problem. So this is factored on the left, and it already says equals 0. This problem is now turned pretty easy. So when two things are being multiplied together, for instance, if a times b is equal to 0, what do we know about a or b? Well, a has to equal 0 or b has to equal 0 for something to multiply together to be equal to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to figure out what makes the left piece equal to 0 and what makes the right piece equal to 0. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take x plus 5 and set it equal to 0. And then you're going to take 3x minus 2 and set it equal to 0. Okay? So these are two simple equations. The first one we are going to subtract 5 from both sides. So x equals negative 5. There's one answer. And this one's a two-stepper. We need to add 2 first. 3x equals 0 plus 2 is 2. And then we need to divide by 3. And we get x equals 2. Oops, I want to make sure I do that correctly. We need to do 2/3. So there is our two answers, negative 5 and 2/3. Now that one was easy because it was already factored for us. Okay, so now let's look at an example where we actually have to factor it first. So example 2, solve the following equation. And what we're going to do is we're going to factor. So I need two sets of parentheses equal to 0. What two things together multiply to be x squared? Well, hopefully you realize that that's x and x. And then lastly, what two numbers multiply to be 6 and add to 5? What two numbers multiply to be 6, add to 5? Hopefully you remember that as 2 and 3. 2 times 3 is 6, but 2 plus 3 is 5. So now it's factored, it's equal to 0, we can solve now. So we have two problems, x plus 2 equals 0, so x plus 2 equals 0, and then we have to do x plus 3 is equal to 0. I keep making little mistakes here, so let me get rid of that. All right, so let's solve each of these. These are two very easy problems to solve. X equals 0, take away 2 is negative 2. So we have to, on this one, subtract 3 from both sides. X equals negative 3. So our two answers are negative 2 and negative 3. So if you were to go back and plug negative 2 into your original equation and negative 3, both of them would be solutions. So you could plug each of these back into the original equation, and you could check your work and show that they are indeed solutions. They would work. The left would equal 0 and the right would equal 0. All right, moving on. Example 3. Now, this one is a little bit harder. It's equal to 0, so all we have to do is factor. But this one is a little bit harder because of this 3. Okay, so let's take this slow. What two things multiplied together are going to be 3x squared? We have a 3x and a 1x. Now, since this 3 is here, we cannot do it the same multiplying and adding way. We just have to circle the negative 4. What combinations of numbers multiply to be negative 4? Okay, negative 4, positive 1, positive 4, negative 1, 2 and negative 2, and negative 2, positive 2. Those are the same. Always start trying the ones without the 4 and without the 1. Okay, always do the ones last. Okay, so the only way you can do this is guessing and checking. So I'm going to put the positive 2 on the left and the negative 2 on the right. And the only way to check these is to try the outside 2 and the inside 2. And that has to equal positive 11. So let's see if this works. 3x times negative 2, the outside 2, is negative 6x. And then 2 times 1 is positive 2x. Is negative 6 plus 2x positive 11? You should see that that is no, that's a negative 4. So if it does not work, you're going to have to try something different. So I'm going to put the negative 2 on the left, the negative 2 on the left, and now I'm going to try negative 2 on the left, and the positive 2 on the right. Now I'm going to try this, see if this works. 3 times 2 is 6x. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2x. That is equal to 4x. That is also not equal to 11. So what we've done now is we've canceled out the 2 and the negative 2. So now we have to move to the 4 and the 1. So I'm going to try, let's see this. I'm going to try the negative 4 here and the positive 1 here. Okay, and we're going to try, see if it works. 3x times negative 4 is negative 12x. 1 times 1 is 1. Negative 12 plus 1 is negative 11x. Is that what we want? No, we want a positive x. So if the number is correct, we got 11, but the sign is wrong, all you have to do is flip your sign. So this needs to now be a positive 4 on the right and a negative on the left. So now, once you get that information, you should be correct now. So now what we need to do is we need to solve the rest of the problem like we did before. You need to take each side of the problem, 3x minus 1, set it equal to 0, and x plus 4, and set it equal to 0. So on this one, we are going to add 1, 3x equals 1. Then you're going to divide by 3. X equals 1/3 is one answer. And this one's easy, just subtract 4 from both sides. X equals negative 4 is the other answer. Now, that problem is much longer. It's a little bit more difficult, but hopefully we can work through that. Okay, so last one. This one is the longest of the problems, so bear with me here. Now, if you notice, it does not equal 0 on the right. So first we have to FOIL first, and then we have to set it equal to 0. So 3x times x is 3x squared. 3x times 4 is 12x. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. And negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. And that's still equal to negative 11. So let's add our like terms. We have 3x squared. 12x, take away 2x is 10x. And then we have negative 8 minus 11. But I would need to add 11 to both sides. Add 11. What do I get? I get negative 8 plus 11, which is 3. And now we are equal to 0. So once you are equal to 0, you are good to go. You can now factor. So let's change this here. Let's factor. All right, so factor. Okay, so what two things multiply together to be 3x squared? Well, that's a 3x and a 1x. What two numbers multiply together to be 3? Well, 1 and 3 and negative 1 and a negative 3. Those are the only combinations. But if you notice, the middle term is positive. So that would automatically cancel the negatives. If everything's positive, then we stick with the positives. All right, so I'm going to put a positive 1 here and a positive 3 here. I have no idea if that's going to work, so I have to check the outside 2 and the inside 2. 3 times 3 is 9x. 1 times 1x is 1x. 9x plus 1x equals 10x. Is that what we want? Hey, we got lucky on the first try. If it did not work, you would take the 3 and the 1 and you'd flip-flop them, and hopefully then that would work. Okay, so once we have the correct answer, we're going to get rid of everything, and we are going to solve the problem. So 3x plus 1 equals 0, and 1x plus 3 equals 0, and solve each of these. So subtract 1, 3x equals negative 1, divide by 3, x equals negative 1/3, 3's cancel. So there's one answer, and then this one is easy, just subtract 3, so x equals 0, take away 3, which is negative 3. So we have our two answers. Now, we went through that quickly. We'll make sure we do a little bit more review the following day, but that is a basic introduction to solving quadratic equations with factoring. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you took good notes, and I will see you tomorrow.